At exactly 7:30 in the morning on July 1st, 1916, whistles blew along a 13-mile stretch of the Western Front. 100,000 British soldiers climbed out of their trenches, formed neat lines, and began walking toward the German positions. Walking, not running. Not crawling, walking. They had been told that the enemy was already dead. For 7 days, British artillery had pounded the German trenches with over 1.5 million shells. The bombardment had been so intense that it could be heard across the English Channel. Nothing, the officers assured their men, could have survived that storm of steel. All the infantry had to do was walk over, occupy the empty trenches, and mop up any dazed survivors. So they walked, shoulder to shoulder, rifles at port arms. Some units kicked footballs ahead of them, treating the advance like a sporting event. One captain led his men into battle carrying only a walking stick. And then the German machine guns opened fire. The Germans had not been destroyed by the bombardment. They had survived in deep concrete bunkers, some more than 30 feet underground. When the shelling stopped, they scrambled up to their positions, set up their weapons, and waited. And when the British infantry appeared walking slowly in perfect formation across open ground, they did what machine guns do. In the first hour, approximately 30,000 British soldiers were killed or wounded. By the end of the day, the casualty count had reached 57,470. Nearly 20,000 of them were dead. It was the bloodiest single day in the history of the British Army before or since. The gains, the British had advanced, on average about a mile. In some sectors, they hadn't advanced at all. The German line, for the most part, held firm. The Battle of the Somme would continue for another 4.5 months. By the time it sputtered out in November, over 1 million men would be dead or wounded, British, French, and German combined. The total territorial gain would be roughly 6 miles. This is the story of how that happened. This is the story of how the most advanced civilizations on Earth built weapons they didn't understand, fought a war they couldn't win, and fed an entire generation into the most efficient killing machine ever created. This is the story of World War I, the meat grinder. To understand how we got to that obscene waste of human life, we need to go back. Back before the trenches, back before the machine guns. Back to a world that, in the summer of 1914, had no idea what was coming. The Europe of 1914 was, by almost any measure, the most advanced civilization in human history. It dominated the globe. European empires controlled vast swaths of Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. European technology, steam engines, telegraphs, railways, electrical grids had transformed human existence in ways that would have seemed magical just a century earlier. European science was unlocking the secrets of the atom, the germ, and the gene. And European militaries were the most powerful the world had ever seen. Every major power in Europe maintained a massive standing army, equipped with the latest weapons and trained according to the most modern doctrines. France had over 4 million men it could mobilize. Germany had even more. Russia, with its endless population, could field the largest army on Earth. These armies were backed by industrial economies that could produce weapons, ammunition, and supplies on a scale never before possible. The great powers had spent decades building up their military capacity, forging alliances, and preparing for a war that many believed was inevitable. And here's the thing, they wanted to fight. Not all of them, of course. Plenty of individuals, particularly socialists and pacifists, warned that a European war would be a catastrophe. But the political and military establishments of the major powers genuinely believed that a war would be short, glorious, and decisive. Why did they believe this? Because that's what their experience told them. The wars of the late 19th century had been brief affairs. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871 had lasted less than a year and ended with a decisive Prussian victory. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905 had been similarly quick and, crucially, seemed to validate the importance of offensive spirit and aggressive tactics. Military theorists across Europe had developed what came to be called the cult of the offensive. The idea was simple. In modern war, the attacker always won. Defense was passive, reactive, cowardly. Offense was active, dynamic, and morally superior. The nation that struck first, struck hardest, and kept attacking would inevitably triumph. This belief was reinforced by the professional culture of European officer corps. These were men raised on stories of Napoleon and Frederick the Great. They admired boldness, elan, fighting spirit. They believed that the morale and willpower of the soldier could overcome any material disadvantage. The French, in particular, developed a doctrine they called attaque à outrance, attack to excess. The idea was that French soldiers, animated by their superior courage and national spirit, would simply overwhelm any enemy through sheer aggression. There was just one small problem with this beautiful theory. Technology had made it obsolete. The weapons available to the armies of 1914 were radically more lethal than anything that had existed in Napoleon's time, or even in 1870, and most military planners simply didn't understand how much this changed the fundamental nature of warfare. Let's talk about those weapons, because they're the key to everything that happened. First, the rifle. By 1914, every major army was equipped with bolt-action magazine rifles. These weapons could fire accurately at ranges of 500 to 1,000 yards or more. A trained soldier could fire 15 rounds per minute. And the bullets they fired small, high-velocity projectiles could punch through flesh and bone with devastating effect. This was not the musket of the Napoleonic Wars, which was lucky to hit a barn at 100 yards. This was a precision killing machine. Second, artillery. The artillery of 1914 was a quantum leap beyond what had come before. Field guns could fire explosive shells with accuracy at ranges of several miles. Heavy howitzers could lob massive shells in high arcs, dropping them onto targets behind hills or in trenches. And crucially, the development of high explosive shells and improved fuses made artillery devastatingly effective against both fortifications and mass troops. By 1914, artillery had become the dominant killer on the battlefield. In the wars to come, roughly 60% of all casualties would be caused by artillery fire. Not bullets, not bayonets, shells. Third, and this is the big one, the machine gun. The machine gun was not exactly new in 1914. Various forms of rapid-fire weapons had existed since the American Civil War, but the modern machine gun, as it existed at the start of World War I, was something qualitatively different. The standard German machine gun was the Maschinengewehr 08, a water-cooled weapon based on Hiram Maxim's original design. It could fire 400 to 500 rounds per minute, with an effective range of over 2,000 yards. One machine gun, manned by a crew of 4 to 6 men, could produce the same volume of fire as an entire company of riflemen, maybe 40 or 50 soldiers. And here's the thing that the generals didn't fully grasp. The machine gun had made frontal assault effectively suicidal. Think about it. You have 100 men charging across an open field. The field is maybe 500 yards wide. The men can cover that distance in, let's say, 3 to 4 minutes at a run longer if they're loaded down with equipment and navigating obstacles. A single machine gun, in 3 to 4 minutes, can fire 1,500 to 2,000 rounds. Even with imperfect accuracy, that's enough to kill or wound virtually every man in that attack. And no army had just one machine gun. They had dozens, hundreds, eventually thousands. The mathematics of the machine gun made offensive infantry tactics almost impossible. But the armies of 1914 didn't understand this. They had never fought against machine guns in large numbers. Their war games and maneuvers hadn't accounted for this new reality. Their entire doctrine was built on the assumption that brave men with bayonets could overcome any obstacle. They were about to find out how wrong they were. There was another factor that made World War I different from all previous conflicts: the sheer scale of mobilization. The armies of 1914 were not small professional forces like those of the 18th century. They were mass conscript armies, drawing upon the entire male population of their nations. When the great powers mobilized for war, they put millions of men into uniform, more soldiers than had ever been assembled in human history. Germany mobilized approximately 3.8 million men in August 1914. France mobilized about 3.5 million. Russia eventually would put over 12 million men into the field. Austria-Hungary, Britain, and the Ottoman Empire added millions more. These armies were equipped, supplied, and transported by industrial economies running at full capacity. Railways moved troops and materiel with unprecedented speed and efficiency. Factories churned out rifles, artillery pieces, and ammunition around the clock. Telegraph networks coordinated operations across vast distances. The result was warfare at a scale that no previous generation could have imagined or survived. When these massive armies clashed, the killing was not measured in thousands, but in hundreds of thousands, eventually in millions. And the worst part, nobody knew how to make it stop. The war began in the summer of 1914, sparked by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary in Sarajevo. The causes of the war are complex tangled alliances, imperial rivalries, nationalist tensions, and miscalculations by leaders who thought they could control the forces they were unleashing. We could spend hours on the origins of the conflict, but that's not really our story today. Our story is about what happened when the shooting started. Every major power entered the war with a plan for quick victory. Germany had the Schlieffen Plan, a massive right hook through Belgium, and northern France designed to encircle and destroy the French army within 6 weeks. France had Plan 17, which called for immediate offensive operations into Alsace and Lorraine. Russia planned to steamroll into East Prussia while the Germans were busy in the West. All of these plans assumed rapid, decisive movement. All of them assumed that the war would be over by Christmas. None of them worked. The German advance through Belgium was slowed by unexpectedly fierce Belgian resistance and the intervention of British forces. The French offensives in Lorraine were bloodbaths, wave after wave of French infantry, dressed in their distinctive bright blue coats and red trousers, marched straight into German machine gun fire. In August 1914 alone, France suffered over 300,000 casualties. It was called the Battle of the Frontiers, and it was a preview of the horror to come. The German advance continued, pushing deep into France. For a few weeks, it seemed like the Schlieffen Plan might actually work. German forces came within 30 miles of Paris. The French government fled to Bordeaux. Total defeat seemed imminent, and then came the First Battle of the Marne. In early September 1914, French and British forces counterattacked along the Marne River. The battle was massive and chaotic, involving nearly 2 million men. The Germans, overextended and exhausted after weeks of marching and fighting, were pushed back. It wasn't a decisive defeat. The German army retreated in good order, but it was enough to stop the advance. The Schlieffen Plan had failed. Germany would not knock France out of the war in 6 weeks. The nightmare of a two-front war, which German planners had desperately tried to avoid, was now a reality. What happened next would define the conflict. After the Marne, both sides tried to outflank each other, racing northward toward the English Channel. This was the race to the sea, and it resulted in a continuous line of battles stretching from the Swiss border to the Belgian coast. By November 1914, there was no more open flank to turn. The entire Western Front had solidified, and then the soldiers started digging. The trench system that would define World War I emerged organically as a response to the killing power of modern weapons. Soldiers quickly learned that being above ground was death. Artillery would find you, machine guns would find you. The only safety was in the earth. At first, the trenches were simple shallow scrapes in the ground, little more than foxholes connected by shallow ditches. But as the months passed and it became clear that the war would not be over quickly, the trench systems grew more elaborate. By 1915, the Western Front had become an underground world. The trenches were 6 to 8 feet deep, reinforced with timber and sandbags. They zigzagged to prevent enfilade fire. A single shell or machine gun burst traveling down a straight trench could kill dozens. Communication trenches connected the front line to support trenches and rear areas. Bunkers and dugouts provided shelter from artillery bombardment. The space between the opposing trench lines became known as no man's land. It varied in width from a few hundred yards to over a mile. It was a wasteland of mud, craters, rusting barbed wire, and unburied bodies. To cross it in daylight was almost certain death. This was the stalemate. This was the Western Front, and the generals had no idea how to break it. The problem was conceptually simple but practically unsolvable. The defense had become overwhelmingly stronger than the offense. With machine guns, artillery, and trenches, a relatively small force could hold off a much larger attacking army. And every major attack followed the same pattern. First, an artillery bombardment, lasting days or even weeks, intended to destroy the enemy trenches and kill the defenders. Then, an infantry assault, with thousands of men going over the top and advancing across no man's land. Then, slaughter. The artillery bombardment never destroyed as much as planned. The machine guns were always waiting. The attacking infantry was cut down before it could reach the enemy trenches. And even when attacks succeeded in capturing a section of trench, the victory was usually temporary. The defenders would retreat to secondary positions, regroup, and counterattack. The attackers, exhausted and exposed, would find themselves pushed back to their starting positions or worse. Every offensive on the Western Front followed this grim pattern. The names became synonymous with futility and death. Neuve Chapelle, Loos, Champagne, Artois, and eventually, inevitably, the Somme and Verdun, the great charnel houses of 1916. Why didn't the generals learn? Why did they keep ordering the same attacks, expecting different results? This is one of the most debated questions in military history, and the answers are complicated. Some historians have argued that the generals were simply incompetent, donkeys leading lions, as the famous phrase has it. Others have pointed out that the generals faced genuinely impossible constraints and did the best they could with the tools available. The truth is probably somewhere in between. The generals of World War I were not stupid men. Many of them had distinguished careers and had proven their competence in earlier conflicts. But they were products of their training and their era. They had been taught that offense was the key to victory, and they struggled to abandon that belief even as the evidence piled up against it. They also faced enormous political pressure. The war had to be won. Territory had to be liberated. The enemy had to be defeated. Sitting in trenches and waiting for something to change was not acceptable to the governments and populations that were sacrificing so much for victory. And crucially, the generals didn't have good alternatives. The technology of offense had not kept pace with the technology of defense. Tanks, effective aircraft, and improved infantry tactics would eventually provide solutions, but not until near the end of the war. In 1915 and 1916, the generals were trapped. They couldn't win with the tools they had, but they couldn't admit that either. So they kept attacking, and the soldiers kept dying. The year 1916 would be the year of the great battles, the year when both sides threw everything they had at breaking the stalemate, and both sides failed at an almost unimaginable cost in human life. And it all began with a German offensive at a small French fortress city that most of the world had never heard of, a place called Verdun. Verdun was not a strategically vital objective. It was not a major industrial center. It was not a crucial transportation hub. In purely military terms, there was no compelling reason to fight for it. But Verdun was French, deeply, symbolically, historically French. The fortress city had guarded the eastern approaches to France for centuries. It had held out against the Prussians in 1870 when almost everything else had fallen. It represented French determination, French courage, French nationhood. Losing Verdun would be a psychological blow that France might not survive, and that's exactly why the Germans chose to attack it. The architect of the Verdun offensive was General Erich von Falkenhayn, the chief of the German General Staff. Falkenhayn was a coldly analytical man, and he had reached a coldly analytical conclusion. Germany could not break through the Allied lines. The trench stalemate was real, and no amount of offensive spirit would overcome machine guns and barbed wire. But Germany could still win the war not by breaking through, but by bleeding France to death. Falkenhayn's plan was brutal in its simplicity. He would attack a position that France could not afford to lose. France would be forced to defend Verdun at all costs, throwing division after division into the meat grinder. German artillery, the most powerful concentration of firepower the world had ever seen, would systematically destroy these defenders. France would bleed white, as Falkenhayn put it, and eventually collapse. It was, in essence, a war of attrition deliberately designed. Not a battle to gain ground, but a battle to kill. Verdun would be, in Falkenhayn's own chilling phrase, a blood pump. The offensive began on February 21, 1916, with an artillery bombardment of unprecedented intensity. Over 1,200 German guns opened fire along an 8-mile front. In the first day alone, the Germans fired over 1 million shells, the ground shook, the sky burned. French soldiers in the forward trenches were simply obliterated, buried alive, blown to pieces, driven mad by the endless concussion. Then the German infantry advanced. The first days were catastrophic for France. German stormtroopers, using new infiltration tactics, pushed through the shattered French lines. Key positions fell. The vital Fort Douaumont, the largest of the Verdun fortresses, was captured by a small German raiding party that found it virtually undefended, a humiliating blow to French prestige. For a moment, it seemed like Verdun might fall. The French high command panicked. Reinforcements were rushed forward in desperate haste, and command of the defense was given to a general who would become one of France's greatest heroes and, decades later, one of its greatest villains. General Philippe Pétain arrived at Verdun on February 25th and immediately set about organizing the defense. Pétain was different from many French generals. He was cautious, methodical, and genuinely concerned about the welfare of his soldiers. He understood that the key to holding Verdun was not dramatic counterattacks, but careful husbanding of resources and systematic rotation of units. Pétain organized the Voie Sacrée, the sacred way, a single road from Bar-le-Duc to Verdun that became the lifeline of the defense. Day and night, trucks rolled up this road carrying supplies, ammunition, and fresh troops. At its peak, one vehicle passed every 14 seconds. Without the sacred way, Verdun could not have held, and Pétain established the principle of Noria, the constant rotation of divisions through the Verdun sector. Units would spend a limited time in the Inferno, then be pulled back to rest and refit. This meant that the burden of defense was shared across the entire French army. By the end of the battle, roughly 70% of the French army had served at Verdun. It was a national experience, a crucible through which almost an entire generation passed. But holding Verdun came at a terrible price. The fighting at Verdun was unlike anything the world had ever seen. The concentrated artillery fire churned the ground into a lunar landscape of overlapping craters. Trenches were obliterated almost as fast as they could be dug. Men lived and fought and died in a hellscape of mud, fire, and flying steel. The conditions were almost beyond description. Soldiers crouched in shell holes filled with stagnant water and decomposing bodies. The smell of death was everywhere. Corpses that couldn't be buried, latrines that overflowed, gangrene spreading through untreated wounds. Men went days without food or water because supply parties couldn't make it through the bombardment. And the killing never stopped. Artillery shells fell around the clock, week after week, month after month. Men were buried alive by near misses, dug out by their comrades, and buried again. Shell shock, what we now call PTSD, became epidemic. Soldiers' minds simply broke under the strain. One French lieutenant wrote, "Hell cannot be so terrible. Men are mad." A German soldier described the battlefield as a place where men sacrifice their lives and leave their bodies to rot in the mud. Both sides fought with desperate courage, and both sides died in roughly equal numbers. And that was the terrible irony of Falkenhayn's plan. He had designed Verdun as a trap for France, a place where French soldiers would be systematically slaughtered by German artillery. But the French artillery was almost equally effective. German attacking troops suffered just as terribly as French defenders. The blood pump drained both nations. The Battle of Verdun lasted 10 months from February to December 1916. In that time, approximately 700,000 men were killed or wounded. The French lost around 377,000. The Germans lost around 337,000. The front line moved, at most, a few miles in either direction. France held Verdun. It became a symbol of national determination, a rallying cry. "Ils ne passeront pas," they shall not pass. But the victory, if you can call it that, was Pyrrhic. An entire generation of young Frenchmen was shattered at Verdun. The psychological scars would endure for decades and, some would argue, contributed to France's collapse in 1940. Falkenhayn, for his part, was relieved of command in August 1916. His strategy had not worked. France had not collapsed, and Germany had bled just as badly as its enemy. The meat grinder had ground up both sides equally. But even as Verdun raged, another catastrophe was unfolding to the northwest. The British were about to learn the same lessons the French had learned at the same terrible cost. The Battle of the Somme. The Somme offensive was originally conceived as a joint Franco-British operation, planned for the summer of 1916. It was supposed to be primarily a French effort, with British forces playing a supporting role. But then Verdun happened, and suddenly the French army was fighting for its life. The burden of the Somme shifted to Britain. For Britain, the Somme would be the coming-of-age battle and the death of a new kind of army. When the war began in 1914, Britain had a small professional army, the British Expeditionary Force. It was well-trained and well-equipped, but it was tiny compared to the continental conscript armies. Britain had traditionally relied on its navy for defense and had never maintained a mass army. But this war was different. Britain needed millions of soldiers, and it needed them fast. The answer was the new army, raised through a massive volunteer recruitment campaign led by Field Marshal Lord Kitchener. Kitchener's face, stern, mustachioed, pointing directly at the viewer, became one of the most iconic images of the war. "Your country needs you," the posters declared, and young men responded in their hundreds of thousands. These volunteers were organized into what became known as PALS battalions, units recruited from the same towns, neighborhoods, workplaces, or social clubs. The idea was that men would fight better alongside their friends and neighbors. Entire communities enlisted together. The Accrington Pals, the Leeds Pals, the Grimsby Chums, clerks and factory workers, miners and shopkeepers, schoolboys and school teachers all marching off to war together. It was a terrible idea. By July 1916, the new army was ready, over 500,000 volunteers, enthusiastic and eager to prove themselves. They had trained for months, they had been told that they would win the war, and now they were being sent to the Somme. The plan was straightforward. A massive artillery bombardment, the largest in history up to that point, would destroy the German defenses. Then the infantry would advance, occupy the ruined trenches, and break through into open country beyond. Cavalry would exploit the gap. The war would finally become one of movement again. General Sir Douglas Haig, the commander of the British Expeditionary Force, was confident. His artillery had been pounding the German lines for a week. Over 1.5 million shells had been fired. Surely nothing could have survived. But Haig had made a critical error. Many of his shells were duds. They failed to explode. Many others were shrapnel shells, designed to kill exposed troops, but ineffective against deep bunkers. And the German defenses on the Somme were the most elaborate on the Western Front, deep dugouts carved into the chalk, virtually impervious to anything but a direct hit from the heaviest shells. The bombardment looked impressive. It sounded impressive, but it hadn't worked. And so we return to that morning of July 1st, 1916. The whistles blew. The men climbed out of their trenches, and they walked into hell. The slaughter was immediate and almost total. German machine gunners, emerging from their bunkers as soon as the bombardment lifted, found perfect target swaths of British infantry advancing in neat lines across open ground. They didn't even need to aim carefully. They simply traversed their guns back and forth, cutting swaths through the attackers. The PALS battalions were annihilated. In the village of Accrington, 585 men of the Accrington PALS went over the top that morning. Within 20 minutes, 235 were dead and 350 were wounded. Almost every family in the town lost someone. In Leeds, the news was the same. In Barnsley, in Manchester, in Sheffield, entire communities that had enlisted together were destroyed together. The telegram boys made their rounds, delivering death notices to house after house on the same street. In some neighborhoods, there was no one left to mourn. The first day of the Somme, July 1st, 1916, remains the bloodiest day in British military history. 57,470 casualties, including nearly 20,000 dead. The German casualties that day were approximately 8,000. It was a ratio of 7 to 1. But the battle didn't stop. It couldn't stop. Haig was committed. The French were counting on the British to relieve pressure on Verdun. There was no alternative but to continue. And so the attacks continued day after day, week after week, month after month. The tactics adapted somewhat. The neat lines gave way to more dispersed formations. Artillery techniques improved. New weapons were introduced. But the fundamental problem remained unsolved. Crossing no man's land against machine guns was still suicide. Small gains were made at enormous cost. Villages that had been reduced to rubble changed hands multiple times. Woods were fought over until no trees remained, just splintered stumps in a sea of mud. The names became entries in the ledger of the dead. Thiepval, Mametz, Delville Wood, called Devil's Wood by the soldiers, High Wood, Piziers. In September, a new weapon appeared on the battlefield for the first time, a weapon that would eventually help break the stalemate, though not yet. This was the tank. The first tanks were crude machines, slow, unreliable, and terrifying to their own crews. They were developed in secrecy under the cover name water tanks, which is where the name came from, and rushed into service before they were truly ready. Only 49 tanks were available for the first attack, and many of them broke down before reaching the enemy lines. But those that made it across no man's land achieved something remarkable. They crushed barbed wire. They were impervious to machine gun fire. German soldiers, seeing these metal monsters lurching toward them, sometimes fled in terror. For a brief moment, it seemed like the answer had been found. It hadn't, not yet. The tanks were too few, too slow, and too mechanically unreliable to achieve a decisive breakthrough. They frightened the Germans but didn't defeat them. The technology was promising, but it wasn't ready. The Battle of the Somme finally ground to a halt in November 1916, ended more by the autumn rains than by any strategic decision. The ground had turned to bottomless mud, movement became impossible. Men drowned in shell craters filled with liquid muck. Even the generals had to admit that continuing was pointless. The butcher's bill was staggering. British casualties numbered approximately 420,000. French casualties, for they had fought hard on the southern sector of the Somme, were around 200,000. German casualties were somewhere between 450,000 and 600,000, depending on which estimates you believe. And the gains. The Allies had advanced, at most, about 6 miles. The German line had bent but not broken. The war was no closer to ending than it had been in January. The Somme and Verdun, together the twin catastrophes of 1916, killed or wounded approximately 2.5 million men. And nothing had changed. The trenches still stretched from Switzerland to the sea. The machine guns still waited. The artillery still thundered. This was the meat grinder. This was industrial warfare in its purest, most horrifying form. Human beings fed into a machine of destruction, ground up and discarded, replaced by fresh bodies, fed into the machine again. How did men endure this? How did they keep fighting, keep going over the top, keep facing almost certain death? The answers varied. Some fought out of patriotism, believing genuinely in their country's cause. Some fought out of hatred for the enemy, fueled by propaganda that portrayed the other side as monsters. Some fought out of fear of being shot for cowardice, fear of disappointing their comrades, fear of the shame that would fall on their families if they refused. But increasingly, men fought simply because their friends were fighting. The primary group, the squad, the platoon, the company became everything. Soldiers developed intense bonds with the men beside them, bonds forged in shared suffering. They fought not for king or country, but for the men in the next shell hole, and they developed a black humor that helped them cope. Soldiers on the Western Front joked about death constantly. They gave ironic names to the worst places. Happy Valley for a ravine swept by artillery fire, Suicide Corner for an intersection targeted by snipers. They sang songs that mixed cheerfulness with despair. We're here because we're here, because we're here, because we're here, ... The trench newspapers, produced by soldiers for soldiers, were full of gallows humor. Cartoons depicted death as a familiar companion. Poems mocked the generals who ordered impossible attacks. It was a coping mechanism. If you couldn't change your situation, you could at least laugh at it. But underneath the humor, there was trauma, deep, lasting, often permanent trauma. Soldiers who survived the war carried invisible wounds for the rest of their lives. Shell shock victims shook uncontrollably, had nightmares, couldn't hold jobs, couldn't maintain relationships. The psychiatric casualties of World War I numbered in the hundreds of thousands, and society didn't know how to deal with them. Shell shock was often seen as cowardice, a failure of moral fiber rather than a medical condition. Thousands of traumatized soldiers were court-martialed and shot for desertion or cowardice. Many more were institutionalized or simply left to suffer in silence. The meat grinder destroyed minds as efficiently as it destroyed bodies. By the end of 1916, something had changed in the armies of the Western Front. The enthusiasm of 1914 was gone. The volunteers who had marched off singing were dead or disillusioned. The soldiers who remained were harder, more cynical, more professional, and, increasingly, more skeptical of their leaders. The French army, in particular, was reaching a breaking point. The losses at Verdun and the Somme had been catastrophic. Morale was plummeting. Soldiers began to question why they were dying for gains measured in yards. A dangerous mood was spreading through the ranks. In 1917, that mood would explode into something that terrified the French High Command more than any German offensive: mutiny. By 1918, gas was ubiquitous. Mustard gas, phosgene, and other agents were delivered by artillery shells in enormous quantities. Gas masks were standard equipment. Soldiers became experts at detecting gas. The smell of garlic meant mustard gas. The smell of fresh hay meant phosgene. The psychological effect of gas was as important as the physical casualties. Men fighting in masks were impaired, their vision was limited, communication was difficult, and fear was constant. Gas never became the war-winning weapon some had hoped. But it added another layer of horror to the battlefield and forced both sides to develop new protective equipment and decontamination procedures. It was a technology race within a technology war. Third, aircraft. In 1914, airplanes had been fragile novelties used primarily for reconnaissance. By 1918, they had become essential instruments of warfare. Fighter aircraft dueled for control of the skies. The names of the great aces Manfred von Richthofen, Eddie Rickenbacker, Billy Bishop became famous. Their dogfights captured the public imagination in a way that trench warfare never could. Here, at last, was something romantic about war: individual combat, skill against skill, knights of the air. But the real importance of aircraft was more prosaic. Reconnaissance planes photographed enemy positions, revealing the layout of trenches and the location of artillery batteries. Observation planes directed artillery fire, dramatically improving accuracy. Ground attack aircraft strafed trenches with machine guns and dropped small bombs on enemy positions. And bombers were beginning to strike targets far behind the lines: supply depots, railway junctions, even cities. The technology was primitive by later standards, but the implications were revolutionary. No place was truly safe anymore. The battlefield extended from the front lines to the factories and homes of the enemy nation. Fourth, and most important of all, the tank. The tanks that had appeared at the Somme in 1916 were experimental prototypes, proof of concept, rather than decisive weapons. But over the following 2 years, tank technology improved dramatically. The vehicles became faster, more reliable, and more numerous. Crews learned how to use them effectively. Tactics evolved to integrate tanks with infantry and artillery. The breakthrough came at Cambrai in November 1917. The Battle of Cambrai was designed as a demonstration of what tanks could achieve when used properly. Instead of the usual prolonged bombardment which destroyed the ground, warned the enemy, and left the tanks struggling through a moonscape of craters, the attack would begin with a surprise assault. Tanks would crush the barbed wire and suppress machine guns. Infantry would follow close behind, exploiting the gaps the tanks created. On the morning of November 20th, 1917, nearly 400 tanks rolled forward toward the German lines. Behind them came 6 infantry divisions. There had been no preliminary bombardment. The Germans were caught completely off guard. The results were stunning. In a matter of hours, the British advanced over for miles a distance that had taken months to achieve at the Somme. The Hindenburg Line, the most formidable German defensive position on the Western Front, was breached. Church bells rang in England for the first time in years, celebrating what seemed like a decisive victory. But Cambrai also revealed the limitations of 1917 technology. The tanks broke down in alarming numbers. Over half were out of action by the second day, victims of mechanical failure, enemy fire, or the simple difficulty of navigating the battlefield. There were no reserves to exploit the breakthrough. And the Germans, recovering from their surprise, launched a devastating counterattack that recaptured most of the lost ground. Cambrai was not the end of the stalemate, but it was a preview of the end. It showed that tanks, used correctly, could break through fortified positions. It showed that the deadlock was not permanent. and it pointed the way toward the combined arms tactics tanks, infantry, artillery, and aircraft working together that would dominate the battlefields of the future. Meanwhile, another factor was entering the equation, one that would ultimately prove decisive: America. The United States had entered the war in April 1917, driven by German submarine warfare, the Zimmermann telegram, and a growing sense that neutrality was no longer possible. But American participation took time to become effective. The U.S. Army in 1917 was tiny, barely 100,000 men, with no experience of modern warfare. Building, training, and transporting a mass army would take at least a year. For Germany, this created a window of opportunity. Russia was out of the war. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were being transferred from the Eastern Front to the West. For a brief moment, Germany would have numerical superiority on the Western Front. If they could defeat France and Britain before the Americans arrived in force, they could still win the war. The result was the German Spring Offensive of 1918, the Kaiserschlacht, the Kaiser's Battle. It was the last great gamble of the German Empire, and it would determine the fate of nations. The offensive began on March 21, 1918, with the most sophisticated artillery bombardment of the war. German gunners had perfected the techniques of predicted fire, surprise attack, and mixed ammunition. In 5 hours, they fired over 1 million shells, high explosives, gas, smoke across a 50-mile front. The British Fifth Army, stretched thin and caught off guard, was overwhelmed, and then came the stormtroopers. German infantry tactics had evolved dramatically since 1914. The stormtroopers' specially trained assault troops didn't attack in lines or waves. They moved in small groups, probing for weak points, bypassing strong points, infiltrating deep into enemy positions. They were armed with grenades, light machine guns, and flamethrowers. They were trained to keep moving, to exploit success, to spread chaos in the enemy rear. The breakthrough was stunning. In the first day, the Germans advanced over 4 miles more than the British had gained in 5 months at the sum. In the following weeks, they pushed forward nearly 40 miles, threatening to separate the British and French armies and drive to the Channel ports. For a moment, it seemed like the war might end in German victory. But the spring offensive ultimately failed, for reasons that revealed both the potential and the limitations of the new tactics. The Germans had broken through, but they couldn't sustain the breakthrough. Their supply lines were stretched to the breaking point. Trucks and horses couldn't keep up with the advancing infantry. Ammunition ran short. Food ran out. German soldiers, reaching Allied supply depots, were often more interested in looting food and alcohol than in pressing the attack. And critically, the Germans had no answer to Allied reserves. The British and French, and increasingly, the Americans could use trucks and railways to move reinforcements faster than the German infantry could advance on foot. Every breakthrough was eventually contained, sealed off, and counterattacked. The spring offensive cost Germany over 500,000 casualties, losses that couldn't be replaced. The best soldiers, the carefully trained stormtroopers, were disproportionately killed or wounded. What remained was a tired, hungry, increasingly demoralized army, and now the Americans were arriving in force. Over 1 million American soldiers were in France by July 1918, with more arriving every week. Fresh, well-fed, enthusiastic, the doughboys represented exactly the kind of reserves that Germany lacked. The Allied counteroffensive began on August 8, 1918, at Amiens. It was, as General Erich Ludendorff famously called it, the Black Day of the German army. The attack featured everything the Allies had learned over 4 years of war. There was no preliminary bombardment to warn the enemy, just a hurricane of fire at 0 hour. Over 500 tanks led the assault, crushing barbed wire and machine gun nests. Aircraft strafed the German trenches and attacked reinforcements on the roads. Infantry, trained in the new infiltration tactics, followed close behind the tanks. The German line collapsed. In a single day, the Allies advanced 8 miles, a distance that would have seemed miraculous in 1916. Thousands of German soldiers surrendered. Many units simply disintegrated, and this time the breakthrough was sustained. The Allies kept attacking, day after day, week after week. The 100 Days Offensive, as it came to be known, drove the German army back across France and Belgium. The Hindenburg Line, the supposedly impregnable final defensive position, was breached in September. By October, German resistance was crumbling everywhere. The technology of offense had finally caught up with the technology of defense. Tanks, aircraft, improved artillery, and sophisticated infantry tactics had broken the stalemate. The meat grinder was running in reverse, but technology alone didn't end the war. Germany collapsed from within as much as it was defeated in the field. The naval blockade had strangled the German economy. Civilians were starving. The flu pandemic of 1918 killed soldiers and civilians alike. Revolutionary sentiment was spreading, inspired, in part, by the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. Sailors mutinied at Kiel, soldiers' councils formed in the rear areas. The Kaiser's authority evaporated. On November 9, 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. 2 days later, on November 11th, at 11 a.m., the guns fell silent. The war was over. The silence must have been almost unbearable. For years, the Western Front had been a continuous roar of artillery, a constant chatter of machine guns, an endless cacophony of destruction. And then, suddenly, nothing, just silence and the moans of the wounded, and the slow realization that it was finally, impossibly over. The cost was almost beyond comprehension. Approximately 10 million soldiers were dead. Another 20 million were wounded, many permanently maimed, blind, limbless, facially disfigured, mentally shattered. Civilian deaths from famine, disease, and violence added millions more. Entire nations were traumatized in ways that would take generations to heal, if they ever healed at all. And what had it all been for? The peace that followed the Treaty of Versailles and its associated agreements created as many problems as it solved. Germany was humiliated but not destroyed, left resentful and revanchist. New nations were carved from the wreckage of empires, their borders drawn carelessly, their populations mixed and hostile. The seeds of future conflicts, including World War II, were planted in the very peace settlements that were supposed to end war forever. The war to end all wars ended nothing. 20 years later, the world would be at war again, with weapons even more terrible and casualties even more vast. So, what do we learn from all this? What is the lesson of the meat grinder? Perhaps it's simply that technology moves faster than human wisdom. The weapons of 1914 were the products of a century of industrial revolution, the application of scientific knowledge and manufacturing capability to the ancient problem of killing. But the tactics of 1914 were still rooted in the Napoleonic era, in visions of cavalry charges and bayonet assaults and the decisive battle that ends the war in an afternoon. The generals of World War I weren't stupid, but they were prisoners of their training, their experience, and their assumptions. They couldn't imagine a war that their weapons had made inevitable, a war of attrition, of entrenchment, of industrial slaughter. And by the time they understood what they were facing, millions were already dead. Perhaps the lesson is that hubris kills. The leaders who took Europe to war in 1914 were confident that they could control the forces they were unleashing. They were wrong. War, once begun, has its own logic, its own momentum. It devours nations and generations. It makes fools of planners and prophets. Perhaps the lesson is that human beings can endure almost anything, and that this endurance is both inspiring and terrifying. The soldiers of the Western Front lived through horrors that should have broken them. Many did break, but many more somehow found the strength to continue, to fight, to survive. That resilience is a testament to something deep in human nature. But it also enabled the killing to continue far longer than it should have. If soldiers had refused to fight earlier, if they had mutinied en masse as the French did in 1917, perhaps fewer would have died. Or perhaps there is no lesson. Perhaps the First World War was simply a catastrophe, a senseless tragedy, a crime against humanity committed by nations that should have known better. Perhaps the only appropriate response is grief for the millions who died, grief for the world that was lost, grief for the future that was poisoned before it could begin. The last veterans of World War I are gone now. The trenches have been filled in, the battlefields have been plowed and planted, the monuments stand weathered and forgotten in quiet fields. The war has passed from memory into history. But the echoes remain. The borders drawn after 1918 still shape conflicts today. The weapons developed in that war tanks, aircraft, chemical agents evolved into the arsenals of modern militaries. The trauma of the trenches influenced art, literature, philosophy, and politics for a century. The cynicism born in the mud of Flanders poisoned faith in institutions, in leaders, in the very idea of progress. And the fundamental problem exposed by World War I, the gap between our technological capacity for destruction and our wisdom in using it, has only grown wider. We now have weapons that can destroy civilization itself. We have not developed the wisdom to ensure we never use them. The meat grinder of 1914 to 1918 was terrible beyond imagining, but it was also a warning. A warning about what happens when nations armed with industrial technology go to war without understanding what that means. A warning about the consequences of hubris, nationalism, and the failure of diplomacy. A warning about the fragility of civilization and the ease with which it can collapse into barbarism. That warning is over a century old now. The question is whether we've learned from it. The guns fell silent on November 11, 1918, at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. We still mark that moment in ceremonies and services around the world. We wear poppies, we observe silences, we recite the names of the dead. But remembrance is not the same as understanding. And understanding is not the same as wisdom. The meat grinder ran for 4 years and consumed a generation. The world that emerged from it was haunted, broken, and dangerous. And the machines are still running. We've just given them new names. The spring of 1917 was supposed to be the year everything changed. A new French commander, General Robert Nivelle, had promised a breakthrough. He had a secret plan, he claimed, that would end the war in 48 hours. The Germans would be swept away. The trenches would become a memory. Victory was finally at hand. Nivelle was charming, confident, and politically well-connected. He had made his reputation at Verdun, where his counterattacks in the final months had recaptured much of the lost ground. He spoke excellent English, which made him popular with British politicians. And he radiated certainty at a time when everyone desperately wanted to believe that the nightmare could end. His plans centered on a massive offensive along the Chemin des Dames, a ridgeline in the Champagne region. French forces would attack with overwhelming strength, using new artillery techniques and aggressive infantry tactics. The Germans would be surprised and destroyed. Paris would celebrate. The war would be over. There was just one problem. The Germans knew exactly what was coming. Nivelle had talked too much. He had shared his plans too widely. Security was virtually non-existent by the time the offensive launched on April 16, 1917. The Germans had reinforced the Chemin des Dames with additional divisions, artillery, and machine guns. They had prepared deep defensive positions. They were waiting. The Nivelle offensive was a catastrophe from the first hour. French infantry advanced into the same wall of fire that had slaughtered the British at the Somme. The promised breakthrough never materialized. Instead of 48 hours of triumph, there were weeks of grinding, bloody stalemate. French casualties mounted with terrifying speed, over 100,000 in the first 10 days alone. And this time, the French army had had enough. The mutinies began in late April and spread through May and June. They were not, for the most part, violent uprisings. French soldiers didn't turn their guns on their officers or attempt to overthrow the government. What they did was simpler and, in some ways, more devastating. They refused to attack. Unit after unit declared that they would hold the trenches. They would defend France against German assault. But they would not participate in any more suicidal offensives. They would not go over the top again. They would not die for a few hundred yards of mud. The scale of the mutinies was staggering. Somewhere between 30,000 and 40,000 French soldiers were involved. Entire divisions were affected. At its peak, the French army had only reliable divisions between the front lines and Paris. If the Germans had known if they had attacked in force, the war might have ended right there. But the Germans didn't know. French security, so lax before the offensive, became ironclad when it came to concealing the mutinies. The secret was kept from the enemy, from the press, even from France's allies. The world didn't learn the full truth until years after the war ended. The man who saved the French army was, once again, Philippe Pétain. Pétain replaced Nivelle in May 1917 and immediately set about restoring order. But his approach was not primarily punitive. Yes, there were courts-martial. Over 3,400 soldiers were convicted of mutiny. Yes, there were executions. Somewhere between 50 and 60 men were shot. But Pétain understood that the army's problems couldn't be solved by firing squads alone. The soldiers were exhausted, they were traumatized, they were angry, and many of their grievances were legitimate. Pétain reformed the leave system, ensuring that soldiers could return home to see their families regularly. He improved food and living conditions in the rear areas. He visited units personally, listening to complaints and promising change. And most importantly, he pledged that there would be no more grand offensives, no more Verdun's, no more Somme, no more Chemin des Dames. France would wait for the Americans and the tanks. It worked. By the fall of 1917, the French army had stabilized. It would never fully recover its offensive spirit, not until the very end of the war, but it would hold. It would endure, it would survive, but the crisis of 1917 revealed something important about the nature of this war. There were limits to what men could endure. The meat grinder could not run forever. Eventually, something would break, either the enemy's line or your own army's will to fight. The mutinies were a warning, and they weren't unique to France. In Russia, the entire imperial system was collapsing. The February Revolution of 1917 had overthrown Tsar Nicholas II. The provisional government that replaced him tried to continue the war, but the Russian army was disintegrating. Soldiers were deserting by the hundreds of thousands. Entire units refused orders. In October 1917, the Bolsheviks seized power in Petrograd, and within months, Russia was out of the war entirely, signing the humiliating Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918. In Italy, the Battle of Caporetto in October 1917 saw the Italian army suffer a catastrophic defeat, with over 300,000 men surrendering and the front collapsing for nearly 80 miles before stabilizing. It was one of the greatest military disasters of the war. Even the German army, which would later seem so formidable in its final offensives, was showing signs of strain. Food shortages at home, caused by the British naval blockade, were affecting morale. Soldiers on leave returned to find their families starving. Letters from home described desperate conditions. The contrast between the sacrifices demanded at the front and the suffering at home bred cynicism and resentment. By late 1917, every army on the Western Front was exhausted. The question was which side would crack first. But while the armies struggled to survive, something else was happening, something that would eventually matter more than any single battle or offensive. Technology was finally catching up. The weapons that had created the stalemate were being matched, slowly and painfully, by weapons that could break it. And the tactics were evolving too, as officers and soldiers learned from their endless bloody failures. Let's talk about those technological developments, because they would ultimately determine how the war ended. First, artillery. The big guns had always been the dominant killers of the Western Front, but in the early years of the war, they were used crudely. Bombardments were long and telegraphed the coming attack. Accuracy was poor. Shells often fell on empty trenches while defenders sheltered in deep bunkers. By 1917 and 1918, artillery tactics had become far more sophisticated. The development of predicted fire allowed gunners to hit targets accurately without registration shots that gave away the attack. Sound ranging and flash spotting could locate enemy batteries for destruction. Creeping barrages walls of shellfire that advanced just ahead of the infantry provided covering fire during the assault. And perhaps most importantly, the mix of shells had changed. Instead of primarily shrapnel, artillery now fired mostly high-explosive shells that could destroy trenches, bunkers, and barbed wire. Specialized shells carried poison gas, smoke, or incendiary compounds. Artillery had become a precision instrument of destruction. Second, gas warfare. Poison gas had been introduced by the Germans at Ypres in April 1915, when chlorine clouds drifted across French and Algerian positions, causing panic and thousands of casualties. Both sides quickly adopted chemical weapons, and the race between offense and defense continued throughout the war.